Okay, so you're probably here because you want to get to the bottom of things, right?
Yeah.
Like you want to understand how organizations deal with risk,
Yeah.
but without having to wade through a ton of complicated stuff.
That's exactly it. We're going to do a deep dive today. We're going to take a look at the article Risk Management Standards by Pritesh Biswas and really break it down.
Awesome.
We're going to try to figure out, like, what are the big ideas about these standards? How do they work? Why do organizations even need them? You know?
Yeah, that's what we want to know. So right off the bat, there's this basic question, and the article brings this up. What is the difference between a standard and a framework for risk management?
You know, it seems like it might just be a word thing, but it's really not.
Yeah.
It makes a difference. So a standard, the article says, tells you how to do something. It's like the methodology, the process, but then it often also suggests what kind of framework you should be using to support that process.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the standard's the steps and the framework is the whole system that makes those steps work.
I like that. So it's not just, going through the motions. It's actually having a way to think about how those actions fit together.
Yeah.
And the article talks about three main approaches, like almost philosophical approaches to risk management.
Yeah. Yeah.
Different standards, different frameworks kind of approach things in these different ways.
Right.
Can you walk us through those?
Yeah. So the first one is the most obvious one, I guess. It's the risk management approach. And this is what you see in ISO 31000, the British standard BS 3100, the IRM standard, all those the really well-known ones. And they focus on setting up a system. It's a process for identifying, assessing, and then dealing with risks.
Okay, very action-oriented. What's the second one?
The second approach is the internal control approach. So that's things like the COSO internal control framework, the FRC risk guidance. This one's all about having really strong internal control, so like checks and balances
Got it.
inside an organization. And that's how they deal with risk. It's less about having, a separate risk management process and more about making risk part of how they do things every day.
Okay, so it's kind of baked in, the idea of risk.
Yeah.
Interesting. And then the third one.
The third one is kind of cool. It's all about risk-aware culture.
Right.
And this one came from the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. They have the COCO framework. And the idea here is if everyone in the organization is just aware of risk, right? They think about it, they consider it in their work, then you've naturally got good risk management happening all the time.
That's like part of the DNA, the way they do things. I like that. Okay, so the article then moves on to talking about specific internationally recognized risk management standards.
Right.
Let's start with one that everyone has probably heard of, ISO 31000.2019. What's the big deal about this one?
Well, what's really interesting about ISO 31000 is it's super broad, right? So it comes from the International Organization for Standardization,
Yeah.
and they designed it to work for any organization.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't matter how big you are, what industry you're in, it can be applied to any type of organization.
Okay.
And the article really emphasizes how it wants you to make risk management part of like the fabric of the organization. It's not just some separate thing. It's part of how you govern. It's part of how you lead.
Got it. It's not like the risk department over there.
Yeah.
It's everyone.
Yeah.
Right.
It's the whole.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then the article mentions a few specific features.
Right.
What are some of those?
So first of all, it says you need a really well-defined risk management framework. And this is what we were talking about earlier. It's that underlying structure.
Yes.
Then there's a big focus on continuous improvement. They recognize that risk management changes, right? You need to adapt. And then another key feature is strong leadership. It has to come from the top. Management has to be committed to it.
Okay.
And then finally, it talks about communication. It has to be good, and you have to constantly be talking with your stakeholders, internal and external, to make sure everyone's on the same page.
It's like good communication is essential to making this all work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next up, the article talks about CUSO ERM, the Enterprise Risk Management Framework.
Yeah.
This one's from 2017. What's the key thing to understand about this framework?
Well, CISO ERM comes from the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission.
Okay.
It takes this big picture approach, right? It's all about managing risk across the entire organization. And the article really stresses that it's not just about day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
It's about aligning your risk management with your strategy
Right.
and your performance goals. So every decision you make from the top down takes risk into account.
So it's always in the back of your mind when you're making big decisions.
Yeah.
It's not an afterthought. It's right there in the process. And then what are some of the key features that the article focuses on?
So the article says that governance and culture are like the foundation.
The basis of it all.
Yeah, you need that to build effective ERM.
Yeah.
And then you have to set your strategy and your objectives, but you have to think about risk when you do that.
Okay.
And then there's performance, like how risks could affect whether you reach those objectives. And then there's review and revision, right?
Yeah.
Because things change. You have to stay current. And then finally, there's information, communication, reporting. That's how you make sure everyone knows what's going on with risk. You need all the pieces to see the whole picture of risk in the enterprise.
Okay, so very comprehensive. Everything is connected.
Yeah.
All right, then the article moves on to ISO IEC 27005. This one is all about risk management for information security.
Yeah, very specific.
So tell us a bit about this one. What's important here?
Well, as you said, it's a very specific standard. It's part of a family of standards, the ISO IEC 27000 series, and that whole series is all about information security management systems.
Got it.
This one, ISO 27005, is all about using those risk management methods to protect information assets.
Okay.
All about, digital stuff.
Right.
Protecting it from threats and vulnerabilities in the digital world.
Makes sense. Our whole world is digital now. And then the article talks about some of the features.
It does.
What are those?
So there's this whole risk assessment process. It's really detailed.
Yeah.
And the first part is identifying potential risks. Then they analyze how likely it is that the risk will happen and what would happen if it did.
Mhm.
And then they evaluate those risks to see which ones are most important.
Prioritize them.
Exactly. Then they have to decide what to do about those risks. That's the risk treatment part.
Okay.
But then it also stresses that communication's key. You have to talk to stakeholders about these information security risks, and you have to monitor the whole process all the time.
Makes sense. Got to keep an eye on things.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. There's this ASNZS 4360.2004.
Right.
And this one has an interesting history, doesn't it?
It does. It's kind of like the grandfather of a lot of these standards. It was
Okay.
developed by Standards Australia and Standards New Zealand, and it was one of the first, formal risk management standards that was recognized. And it kind of set the stage for what we're doing today, but they withdrew it in 2009. ISO 31000 is the one that everyone uses internationally now.
So it's like the ancestor. What were its key features back when it was in use?
Well, the article says it starts by saying you have to understand the context.
Oh,
Like what's happening in the world and what's happening inside your organization.
got it.
And then it talks about risk identification, figure out what the risks are.
Yeah.
Then you assess those risks. Then you put in place some controls to manage them.
Okay.
And then the last thing is you review the whole process all the time to make sure it's still working.
Okay.
So a very logical process, but it paved the way for the newer ones.
Nice. Okay, so the next one is the NIST Risk Management Framework, specifically NIST SP 837. This one sounds very specific.
Yeah, this one's definitely US based. The article says it comes from the National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Yeah.
And it's all about bringing together security and privacy and risk management, all those ideas, into how the government develops its information systems.
So it's all about cybersecurity for the U.S. government.
Yeah, and not just the government, but also other sectors that work with the government. It's about making sure that security and privacy are part of how they build things from the very beginning.
Makes sense. Very proactive
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah.
Okay, and then what are some of the features that the article highlights for this framework?
So it talks about how they categorize different information systems. They look at, what would happen if there was a security breach or a privacy violation.
Okay.
And they use that to figure out, what security controls are needed. And then they talk about how you have to constantly be monitoring those controls to make sure they're working
Okay.
because the threats are always changing.
So true. All right, then we've got the FIRMA Risk Management Standard. Who is FIRMA, and what is the focus of this one?
FIRMA stands for the Federation of European Risk Management Associations. So this one's all about Europe. It's designed specifically for European organizations, and the article describes it as a very practical standard.
Mhm.
It gives you a hands-on way to make risk management part of your organization.
Practical and European. Got it. Okay, so then what are some of the key features that they focus on?
So again, there's a risk assessment process,
Oh, okay.
but they also have a big emphasis on risk treatment.
Right.
That's, deciding what to do about the risks you find.
Okay.
And then there's monitoring and reporting.
Uh-huh.
And then, again, stakeholder involvement and communication. They really stress that.
It's interesting how that seems to be a common theme.
Yeah.
Okay, then the article goes on to Basel III, Risk Management for Banks.
Right.
This one sounds very specific to the financial world.
Yeah, this one is. It comes from the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision.
Okay.
It's a global framework, and they made it specifically to make the banking system stronger. It's all about managing risks like credit risk, market risk, operational risk. Basically, they want to make sure that banks can survive if things go wrong in the financial world.
Keep the whole system from collapsing.
Exactly.
Very important. And then what are some of the specific features that they focus on?
So the article mentions capital adequacy requirements. That means banks have to keep enough money on hand to cover potential losses.
Okay.
And then there's stress testing. They actually have to test what would happen to the bank in bad economic scenarios.
Yeah.
And then they need better risk reporting, more transparency about the risks they're taking. And then finally, they have to have good liquidity management.
Okay.
That's making sure they have enough cash to pay their bills.
Makes sense. It's a lot of safeguards in there.
Right.
Okay, next up we have the OSIG GRC capability model.
Okay.
What's special about this one?
So OSIG is the Open Compliance and Ethics Group, and this model is all about what they call GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance. It's like a package deal.
Yeah.
And the article says it's a framework to help you make sure that all those things are working together.
Mm-hmm.
So your risk management is aligned with your regulations. It's aligned with ethical behavior.
Okay.
It's all connected.
It's all in sync. Okay, so then what are some of the features?
So it talks about integrating risk management with your governance and your compliance. It's like a three-legged stool.
Yep.
It says you need to make sure everyone in the organization is good at making decisions that consider risk.
Right.
And then it talks about continuous improvement. You always have to be looking at your GRC processes and making sure they're still working.
All right, very holistic.
Yeah.
Okay, last one in this section is the COCO framework, which stands for Criteria of Control. This one goes back to 1995.
Right.
What's the idea behind this framework?
This one was developed by the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants.
Okay.
And the article points out that it's not just about financial controls, which you might think,
Right.
given that it comes from accountants, but it's actually broader than that. It's about how you govern the organization, how you manage it, how it performs overall.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts a lot of emphasis on creating a good risk culture. So everyone in the organization is thinking about risk in the right way.
So again, it's like baking it into the culture, how you do things.
Exactly.
Okay, what are some of the key features that the article highlights?
Well, it says that its main goal is to help you look at your controls and make them stronger.
Okay.
And it also wants to improve governance practices and encourage that continuous improvement that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And then it talks about how it's not just about financial performance, it's also about how well your operations are running. And whether you're following the rules and ethical standards. And then the article talks about its principles, like understanding your objectives, making sure people have the skills and the commitment to do what they need to do, and then monitoring performance and making adjustments.
Okay, so it's very much focused on how people work within the organization. Okay, so now the article steps back a little bit and looks at the bigger picture of risk management standards. What were the big takeaways here?
So the article reminds us that a standard is not just about the process, but it also includes that framework that we were talking about. It's the supporting structure.
Yeah.
And even though some standards separate those things out, in reality, they work together.
Yeah, you need both.
Yeah. And then the article talks about how there's a common structure for the risk management process itself.
What is that?
They call it PIML, which stands for Plan, Implement, Measure, and Learn.
Okay.
And it's very similar to another one you might have heard of, PDCA.
Plan, do, check, act.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So this PML thing, it's just a way to approach risk management in a structured way. You keep learning and you keep adapting as you go.
Got it. Always improving. And then they give us another acronym to help us remember the framework part.
Right, RASP.
Okay.
That stands for Risk Architecture, Risk Strategy, and Risk Protocols.
What do each of those mean?
So risk architecture, that's all the stuff about how risk management is structured.
Mm-hmm.
Who's in charge? How do people communicate? How is it reported?
Okay.
Risk strategy, that's your overall approach to risk.
Okay.
Like how much risk are you willing to take? What's your philosophy on risk?
Right.
And then risk protocols are all the guidelines and rules and procedures, the tools you use to manage risk every day.
RASP. Got it.
Yeah.
Very helpful. And then they talk about the two main jobs of a framework, right?
Yeah.
What are those?
First, it has to support the risk management process itself. It has to be the backbone for all those steps we were talking about.
Okay.
And then second, it has to make sure that all the information you gather about risk is shared with the whole organization
Okay.
so that everyone can benefit from what you're learning.
It's all about sharing and communication.
Right.
Okay. And then they say that most organizations put all these procedures, these guidelines, into one big document.
Yeah, they call it the Risk Management Manual.
Got it.
It's kind of like the Bible for risk management in the organization.
Okay. Moving on, the article then takes a look at the COSO ERM cube. It's like a picture that helps you understand all the parts of their enterprise risk management framework.
All right, it's like a 3D model.
Yeah. Can you break that down for us?
So the COSO ERM cube is all about how you manage risk across the entire enterprise. And the article explains that it's not just about managing risk, but it also brings in the idea of internal controls.
Okay.
And they see ERM not as a set of rules that are set in stone, but as a process. Something that's always evolving, and it's tied in with your strategic goals as an organization.
So it's not a one-time thing, it's always happened.
Exactly.
Okay, and then what are the three main parts of this cube? They call them dimensions, right?
Yeah, they do.
Okay.
So the top of the cube is all about your objectives. And they say there are 4 types: strategic, operations, reporting, and compliance.
Okay, got it.
The front of the cube shows you the 8 components of ERM. There's internal environment, objective setting, event identification, risk assessment, risk response, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring.
Okay.
And then the side of the cube is all about the organizational levels where ERM happens. So there's the entity level, which is the whole organization.
Yeah.
Then there's the division level, the business unit level, and the subsidiary level. It's like a layer cake almost.
Okay, so lots of different levels and they all have to work together.
Yeah, it's like a system, right?
Yeah. And then what's the point of this cube? What's it trying to show us?
The article says it's supposed to show you how all the parts of risk management connect to each other,
Okay.
how they link up with the different objectives, and how it all works at the different levels in the organization. The whole point is to manage risk in a smart way where everything is working together and supporting your strategy and your operations, not just being a separate thing.
Integrated, all working together.
Yeah, and the goal is to create value and make the organization better.
Okay. And they also talk about how risk management needs to be aligned with a couple other things in the organization.
Right, the organization's culture and its decision-making processes.
So risk is not just some separate thing that someone else does.
Mhm.
It's part of how everyone thinks and how decisions are made.
Exactly. It's part of the DNA, like you said.
Yeah.
And then another thing the article points out is that ERM is not a one-time thing.
Right.
It's continuous. You're always monitoring, you're always communicating, you're always adapting.
Okay, so it's an ongoing process. It never really stops.
Right. It's like breathing, right?
Yeah.
You're always doing it, but you don't necessarily think about it all the time.
Okay, and then the article mentions these 4 categories of risk
Yeah.
that are specifically about achieving those corporate objectives that we talked about. What are those?
So the first one is strategic risk. That's anything that could affect your big goals, your mission as an organization.
Okay.
And then there's operational risk. That's about how efficiently you're running your business, how well you're using your resources. Then there's reporting risk, and that's making sure that your reports, both internal and external, are accurate and they're timely.
Okay.
And then finally, there's compliance risk, and that's just making sure that you're following all the laws and regulations and your own internal policies.
Okay, so those categories make it easier to think about the different types of risks that a company might face.
Right.
Okay, now the article moves on to the King III Corporate Governance Code.
Oh.
What is this and where does it come from?
So the King III Code was developed in South Africa, and it came out in 2009. And the article says it's all about having good corporate governance.
Okay.
And they emphasize ethical leadership, sustainability, and being a responsible corporation.
Sounds very progressive.
Yeah, definitely.
And the article touches upon a few specific principles, right?
Yeah. So the first one is ethical leadership and corporate citizenship.
Okay.
That means being honest and transparent and acting like a good citizen. Then there's sustainability. That means thinking about your impact on the environment and society, not just about making money.
Okay, the triple bottom line.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's effective governance structures, and that's all about having a good board of directors that's balanced and independent.
Okay.
Then there's risk management. And this one's all about having a proactive approach to risk and making sure the board is involved.
Okay.
Then there's accountability and transparency.
Okay.
That means giving people accurate information about what's going on.
Makes sense.
Then there's stakeholder inclusivity.
Okay.
So you're considering everyone who has a stake in your business.
Got it.
And then the last one is internal audit and IT governance.
Okay.
They're important for making sure the organization is running well. So lots of principles.
It's very comprehensive. And they have a special way of making sure companies actually follow this code.
Yeah, they call it apply or explain. So basically, they want you to follow all the principles, But if you can't follow one, you have to explain why.
Interesting.
So it gives you some flexibility, but you still have to be accountable.
Okay. And then the article also talks about specific things that the board of directors needs to do to manage risk according to this King III code.
Right. A lot of responsibility.
What are some of those things?
So they have to make sure that they're telling stakeholders everything they need to know about risk.
Okay.
And they have to be in charge of risk governance.
Uh-huh.
They have to decide how much risk the organization is willing to take.
Okay.
They have to make sure they have a risk committee or an audit committee. They have to put someone in charge of risk management. They have to make sure the organization is doing regular risk assessments.
Okay.
They have to think about unexpected risks, things that might come out of left field. They have to have good risk responses.
Okay.
They have to monitor the risk management processes.
Okay.
And they have to get regular reports from management about how all of that's going.
Okay. So lots of oversight, making sure things are happening.
Exactly.
All right. So next up, we have COBIT.
Okay.
Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology.
Right.
This one's all about IT, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So tell us about COBIT.
So the article says that COBIT is really popular in the IT world. And it's basically a framework that gives you all these best practices. They talk about domains and processes, and it's all about having good controls over your IT systems. It's not like a rule book, but it gives you a bunch of principles and practices that come from experts.
Yep.
And it helps you get the most out of your IT investments.
Okay.
And it helps you deliver good IT services, so it's really practical. But the main goal is to make sure that your IT strategy is aligned with what your business needs.
Right, because IT is a huge part of every business now.
Exactly.
And the article mentions some ways that COBIT helps you do that.
Yeah, it talks about how it connects your IT activities directly to what your business needs. And it organizes all the IT stuff into a process model that everyone can understand.
Okay.
It helps you figure out what your most important IT resources are.
Okay.
And it helps you set goals for managing your IT.
Got it. So very structured and goal-oriented. And then what are some of the elements of COBIT itself?
So it has this thing where it separates the governance of IT from the management of IT.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, governance is about making sure that your IT is aligned with your strategy, your overall goals. Management is about actually running the IT systems day to day.
Okay, so governance is more high level, management is more hands-on.
Exactly. And then COBIT has these things called principles and enablers.
Okay.
And they're all about understanding what your stakeholders want and taking a holistic approach.
Okay.
And it also has processes and domains, and these are broken down into governance processes like evaluate, direct, and monitor, and management processes, which are things like align, plan, organize, build, acquire, implement, deliver, service, support, monitor, evaluate, and assess.
Okay, so lots of processes.
Yeah, it's very detailed.
Okay, and then it has a few other things too, right?
Right. It has a process capability model, a goals cascade, guidance on risk and compliance management, metrics for performance measurement, and a focus on managing IT-related risks. So it's a very comprehensive framework.
Got it. And they say it's used a lot in certain industries.
Yeah, it's really popular in regulated industries like finance and healthcare, where security is really important.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, next one is the IRM risk management process.
Okay.
Who's the IRM and what's their approach all about?
So the IRM is the Institute of Risk Management.
Okay.
It's a professional organization for people who manage risk.
Okay.
And they, along with some other professional organizations, have come up with their own standards and processes for managing risk.
Got it.
And the article says that the IRM's approach is all about helping you make good decisions, improve your performance, and avoid losing money.
Okay.
It's about being smart about risk.
Very practical.
Mhm.
So what are some of the key features of their standard?
Well, the article talks about two main parts: the risk management process and the risk management framework.
Okay.
The process is about identifying risks, figuring out how likely they are to happen and what the impact would be if they did, and then coming up with ways to control those risks, whether it's avoiding them, transferring them, mitigating them, or just accepting them.
Okay.
And then they have a process for monitoring and reviewing all that.
Okay.
And the framework is all about the structure that supports all that. So you have your risk architecture, who does what,
Yeah.
your risk strategy, how much risk you're willing to take,
Okay.
and then your risk protocols, all the procedures and tools and stuff you use to manage risk every day.
Okay.
And then the IOM also stresses that you need to integrate risk management with your goals. You
Okay.
need to know how much.